Once they mocked your mind. You remember the exact words. Dramatic. Paranoid, they said them so casually, so confidently, that eventually you started wondering if they were facts instead of opinions. Maybe you really were too sensitive. Maybe you really did read too deeply into things. Maybe every contradiction you noticed was just another story you had created in your head. So you adapted. You became quieter when you wanted to question something. You softened your instincts before anyone else could challenge them. You learned to second-guess the things you noticed, until shrinking yourself felt easier than defending what you could see. But something has shifted. You can feel it in the pauses now, in the hesitation before someone dismisses you, in the way people seem to choose their words more carefully around you. Even in the therapist office, something feels different. The questions aren't the same anymore. They're not asking you to explain why you felt something. They're asking what you noticed, what changed, what you remember, as if the details you once doubted might have been worth paying attention to all along. And suddenly, the story begins to crack. The intensity that once made you too much starts looking like depth. The questions that made you difficult start looking like discernment. The part of you that refused to ignore what didn't make sense starts looking less like a flaw and more like awareness. Nothing about you moved, the lens did. And when that happens, most people become afraid. They retreat, they apologize. They shrink themselves back down to the size everyone else found comfortable. You didn't. They didn't have to attack you directly. Not at first. It was quieter than that. A joke about how much you overthink. An eye roll when you asked a question that nobody else seemed interested in asking. A laugh when you pointed out something that didn't add up. You're reading too much into it. Why do you analyze everything? You're always looking for something wrong. Eventually, you learned that the fastest way to make people uncomfortable was to notice what they wanted everyone else to ignore. You noticed the changes in tone, the pauses that didn't match the words, the sudden shifts in energy, the contradictions between what someone said and what they actually did. And every time you brought one of those things into the light, somehow, you became the problem. Your reaction was too intense. Your questions were too suspicious. Your memory was supposedly unreliable. Their behavior was always given an explanation. Your response was given a label. That's how the confusion started. You would point to what happened, and somehow the conversation would end with you defending why you noticed it. You would explain why something hurt you, and suddenly you were accused of being dramatic. You would ask for clarity, and somehow you became difficult. You would remember something differently, and suddenly you were questioning reality itself, little by little. You started turning the questions inward. Maybe I am overthinking. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe nothing happened the way I remember it. That was the most painful part. Not being misunderstood by them. Being slowly trained to misunderstand yourself. Because when you're the only person in the room noticing something, it's easy to assume you're the one who's wrong. You start watching yourself instead of watching what's happening around you. You monitor your words. You edit your reactions. You hesitate before trusting your own instincts. And eventually, there comes a moment when you stop asking, why are they treating me this way? And start asking something much more dangerous. What's wrong with me? That question can change the way you see everything. But here's what they didn't understand. Something inside you never completely disappeared. Even when you doubted yourself, some quiet part of you kept remembering the details, the patterns, the moments you couldn't explain away. You may have questioned yourself. You may have gone quiet. You may have even believed them for a while, but you never fully stopped noticing. And that small part of you, the part that refused to completely collapse, was still there, waiting for you to trust it again. For a while, you tried to become easier to understand, easier to tolerate. You softened your words before they left your mouth. You stopped asking certain questions. You learned to pause before reacting, not because you were becoming calmer, but because you were afraid of what your reaction might reveal. You spoke less, you noticed less, or at least, you tried to convince yourself that you did, because somewhere along the way, the war stopped being between you and them. It moved inside you. One part of you still wanted belonging. It wanted to be accepted without having to explain every thought, every feeling, every instinct. It wanted to walk into a room and simply exist, without wondering whether someone would turn your intensity into a joke. But another part of you had started wanting something different. Truth. And those two things don't always coexist peacefully. You could keep making yourself smaller and stay comfortable in the eyes of others. Or you could start becoming honest with yourself again. That was the beginning of the quietest battle you've ever fought. Nobody saw the late nights when you replayed conversations in your head. Nobody saw you studying human behavior, trying to understand why people said one thing and did another. You started learning about patterns, emotional regulation, defense mechanisms, attachment. You weren't doing it anymore just to prove that someone else was wrong. You were trying to understand yourself. Why did certain things trigger you? Why did you notice certain changes so quickly? Why did you feel something was wrong before you could explain why? You began separating intuition from fear, observation from assumption, a genuine pattern from a story your mind had created. And slowly, something changed. You stopped reacting to every uncomfortable feeling immediately. You started watching, listening, waiting. You gave yourself enough space to see what was actually happening before deciding what it meant. That was a different kind of strength, because before, they could provoke you and then point to your reaction as evidence that you were the problem. Now, you were becoming harder to pull into that cycle. You didn't need to prove every observation. You didn't need to confront every contradiction. You didn't need everyone to agree with what you saw. You could simply notice and remember. And wait. At first, they didn't notice the difference. They were used to the version of you who reacted quickly, explained too much, defended yourself when misunderstood. But that version was slowly disappearing, not because you had become numb, because you were becoming deliberate. The intensity was still there. The mind was still there. The questions were still there. But now there was something else standing beside them, control. And for the first time, you weren't learning how to silence your mind. You were learning how to understand it. You remember the first time the therapist paused. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden revelation. No moment where someone finally pointed across the room and said, "You were right about everything." It was quieter than that. You had walked into that conversation expecting the same thing you had experienced before. Correction. Explanation. A careful reminder that maybe you were interpreting things too deeply. You were prepared to defend yourself again, to explain why you reacted the way you did, to prove that your feelings had a reason. But then the therapist stopped you, not to dismiss you, to ask a different question. What happened before you felt that way? And for once, the focus wasn't only on your reaction, it was on the context surrounding it. The conversation began moving in a direction you hadn't expected. Questions were being asked about patterns, about repeated interactions, about what happened immediately before your response, about whether the same dynamic had happened more than once. And suddenly, something you had spent so long trying to explain began to look different when it was placed into a larger picture. Your emotions weren't being treated as evidence that you were irrational. They were being explored as information. That distinction mattered because you had spent so long believing that having a strong reaction automatically meant you were wrong. Now you were being asked to understand the reaction instead of simply apologizing for it. And perhaps the most unsettling part was realizing that your story didn't need to be perfect to deserve consideration. You could have misunderstood some things. You could have misread certain moments. You could have reacted too strongly sometimes. And still, that didn't mean everything you experienced was imaginary. That was the crack in the old narrative. Not proof that you had been right about everything. Something more important. Proof that you were allowed to examine your own experience without immediately turning against yourself. And somewhere outside that room, something else was beginning to shift. People who were used to seeing you as reactive started noticing that you were different. You weren't arguing as much. You weren't explaining yourself endlessly. You weren't chasing validation from every person who misunderstood you. You were watching, thinking, choosing your responses. They could feel something changing now. They just couldn't understand it yet, because the version of you they had learned to dismiss was becoming harder to recognize. And the strangest part? You weren't becoming someone new. You were finally becoming someone you could trust. For years, you thought the problem was that you noticed too much. The smallest change in someone's expression, the hesitation before an answer, the sudden shift in someone's tone, the difference between what they said and what their body seemed to communicate. You noticed when the energy in a room changed before anyone acknowledged it. You noticed when someone's words didn't match their behavior. You noticed who had power, who was avoiding responsibility, who was trying to control the direction of a conversation. And because you noticed so much, you were told something must be wrong with you. Too intense, too suspicious, too analytical. But awareness was never the real problem. The problem was that you hadn't yet learned what to do with everything you were noticing. When you don't know how to regulate your attention, awareness can become overwhelming. Every detail feels urgent. Every inconsistency demands an explanation. Every shift in someone's behavior feels like something you have to solve immediately. You weren't necessarily seeing everything perfectly, but you were seeing things, and you were carrying the weight of every observation without knowing which ones deserved your attention. That changed when you began learning control. Not the kind of control that forces you to ignore what you feel. The kind that gives you enough distance to decide what deserves a response. Now, you don't have to chase every inconsistencies. You can notice it without immediately confronting it. You don't have to decode every expression. You can let people reveal themselves over time. You don't have to prove every instinct. You can observe, gather context, and wait. That's what happens when awareness and emotional discipline finally begin working together. Your sensitivity stops controlling you. Your perception becomes something you can use without being consumed by it. And that changes the entire dynamic. They react. You observe, they deflect. You remember, they escalate. You disengage, not because you're afraid to speak, because you no longer need to participate in every battle you're invited into. That's the difference. Before, your intensity was visible. Now your discipline is. And discipline is much harder to manipulate. People can provoke a reaction. They can't easily provoke a decision you have already thought through. They can question your memory, but they can't erase what you quietly documented for yourself. They can change the subject, but they can't force you to forget the pattern you have watched repeat. You are no longer operating from the need to be believed immediately. You're operating from something deeper, self-trust, not blind certainty, not the belief that every instinct is automatically correct. Something more grounded, the ability to say, I notice something. I may not understand it yet, but I don't have to abandon myself just because someone else doesn't see it. That's where your power changed. You stopped using your awareness to constantly defend yourself. You started using it to make better decisions. And suddenly, the same mind they once called too much became the mind that knew when to speak, when to wait, and when to quietly walk away. And then, almost without warning, the dynamic began to change. Not because you announced that you had changed. You didn't confront them with a speech. You didn't demand an apology. You didn't sit everyone down and explain everything you had learned about yourself. You simply stopped playing the role they had assigned to you. And people noticed. The ones who used to laugh at your questions became more careful with their words. The ones who once dismissed your concerns started explaining themselves before you even asked. The jokes became less confident, the eye rolls became shorter. Sometimes there was nervous humor where there used to be certainty, a strange politeness, a pause before an answer. A sudden change in tone when they realized you were paying attention. They could feel it. Something about the old dynamic wasn't working anymore. Because the version of you they knew how to control was the version that reacted exactly as they expected. They knew how to provoke you. They knew how to dismiss your reaction. They knew how to turn your frustration into evidence against you. But now, you were harder to predict. Not because you had become cold, because you had become deliberate. When they pushed, you didn't immediately push back. When they changed the subject, you didn't chase them through it. When they tried to pull you into an argument, you could recognize the invitation without accepting it. And that changed the entire balance of the interaction. People who rely on controlling the narrative become uncomfortable when they can no longer control your emotional response to it. Because once you stop reacting on command, they lose one of their easiest ways to define you. Your anger can no longer be used to explain away their behavior. Your frustration can no longer become the entire conversation. Your silence is no longer surrender. Sometimes it's simply restraint. And restraint can be deeply unsettling to people who were comfortable with the old version of you. Even the way they interacted with therapy began to feel different. The same process they once mocked or dismissed suddenly made them cautious. Questions that once seemed harmless now seemed uncomfortable, because you weren't using therapy as a weapon against them. You were learning how to understand yourself. And that meant you were becoming less dependent on their version of reality. That is what happens when an old dynamic begins to destabilize. When one person changes the way they participate, everyone else has to adjust. The old patterns don't disappear immediately. They test you, they push again. They wait to see if the old you is still there. And this is where most people break. The pressure becomes uncomfortable. The silence feels unbearable. The temptation to return to the familiar becomes stronger than the desire to keep growing, so they go back. They apologize for things they didn't do. They explain themselves again. They shrink. They make themselves comfortable for everyone else. But you did something different. You refined yourself. You didn't become louder. You became harder to pull off balance. Your power stopped looking like confrontation. It started looking like choice. You choose when to respond. You choose what deserves your energy. You choose what you will explain and what you will leave unanswered. And perhaps that's what they sense now. Not that you've become more powerful than them. Something more unsettling. You no longer need them to confirm who you are. And now, there is a version of you they can no longer reach as easily. You don't explain yourself the way you used to. You don't rush to correct every misunderstanding. You don't reveal every thought just because someone asks. And you certainly don't hand people the most vulnerable parts of you, just to convince them that your intentions were good. Something has changed in the way you use your energy. You have become selective. You understand now that not every question deserves an answer. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every misunderstanding deserves a correction. There was a time when silence made you uncomfortable. You thought if you didn't explain yourself, people would believe the wrong story. So you explained more. You gave context. You added details. You tried to make yourself impossible to misunderstand. But eventually, you discovered something. The people committed to misunderstanding you will always find a way, and once you understand that, something inside you becomes quiet. You stop trying to control every version of yourself that exists in someone else's mind. That's emotional economy. You conserve your words. You conserve your reactions. You stop spending your attention on situations that give you nothing back. And suddenly, silence isn't emptiness anymore. It's information, it's space, it's restraint. Sometimes, it's the most honest response you can give. They notice that distance. They may wonder why you're quieter now, why you don't react the same way, why you seem less eager to prove yourself, why they can no longer pull you into long explanations with a single comment. But you're not cold. You're disciplined. There's a difference. Coldness is the absence of feeling. Discipline is feeling everything and still choosing what deserves your response. You still notice. You still care. You still have depth. You just don't give everyone unlimited access to it anymore. And that's why this version of you feels different. You're harder to provoke because you know what provocation is trying to accomplish. You're harder to read because you no longer narrate every internal movement. You're harder to manipulate because you have stopped confusing access with intimacy. People used to know exactly where to press. Now they don't. Not because you've hidden yourself, because you've learned yourself. And that is a much stronger form of protection. But don't mistake this for the end of your story. This isn't your final form. You're not finished. You're not supposed to be. What you're experiencing isn't transformation completed. It's integration. The parts of you that once felt like contradictions are beginning to work together. Your sensitivity with your discipline, your intensity with your restraint, your perception with your patience, your depth with your boundaries. You're not becoming less of yourself. You're becoming more capable of carrying all of yourself without letting every emotion take the wheel. And maybe that's what makes this version of you so difficult to access. You no longer need to disappear to feel safe. You no longer need to perform to feel accepted. And you no longer need to explain your existence to people who have already decided not to understand it. You're still becoming, but now you're becoming on your own terms. Most people don't know what to do with the pain of being misunderstood. Some collapse under it. They become quieter and quieter until there is almost nothing left of the person they used to be. Others go in the opposite direction. They become bitter, suspicious of everyone. They turn every disappointment into proof that people cannot be trusted. But there is another path, a rarer one: integration. It means you don't have to destroy the sensitive parts of yourself just because someone once mocked them. You keep your sensitivity, but you sharpen your logic. You keep your ability to notice subtle changes, but you learn not to react to every change immediately. You keep your empathy, but you add boundaries. You keep your depth, but you stop allowing every emotion to control your decisions. That is the difference between becoming hardened and becoming grounded. You didn't have to become less perceptive. You learned how to carry perception without letting it consume you. You didn't have to stop caring. You learned that caring doesn't require unlimited access. You didn't have to lose your softness. You simply stopped offering it to people who treated it like weakness. And that process can feel incredibly lonely. Because the people around you may still remember the old version. The one who reacted quickly, the one who explained everything. The one who needed reassurance that they weren't imagining things. They may not understand the person standing in front of them now. And sometimes, neither will you. Because growth can feel strange when you're used to measuring yourself by how comfortable everyone else feels around you. The old you wanted to be understood immediately. The new you can tolerate being misunderstood. The old you defended every reaction. The new you examines it. The old you needed to win the conversation. The new you wants to understand the situation. The old you gave people access because you wanted connection. The new you gives access because trust has been earned. That's why loneliness feels different now. Before, loneliness felt like rejection. Now, sometimes it feels like choice. You are no longer surrounded by people simply because you're afraid of being alone. You are learning to sit with yourself without rushing to fill the silence. And in that silence, something becomes clear. You didn't lose yourself. You separated yourself from the parts that were built only to survive other people's expectations. The sensitivity stayed. The empathy stayed. The depth stayed. But now they have structure. They have boundaries. They have direction. And that is why this path is so rare. Anyone can become bitter. Anyone can become numb. Anyone can disappear into the version of themselves that keeps everyone else comfortable. But it takes something different to remain open without remaining unprotected. To remain perceptive without becoming consumed. To remain compassionate without abandoning yourself. That is what integration looks like. Not becoming someone else. Finally becoming someone you can live with. Imagine who you become from here. Imagine the rooms you haven't entered yet. The conversations you haven't had. The negotiations, the relationships. The moments when someone tries to pull you back into an old version of yourself. You won't have to prove yourself the way you once did. You won't need to explain every decision. You won't need to convince everyone that you are intelligent, perceptive, or worthy of being taken seriously. Your composure will speak before you do. The mind they once mocked will become the mind that builds system strategies, stability. You will notice patterns before they become problems. You will recognize dynamics before they become disasters. You will know when to move closer, when to negotiate, and when to quietly step away. Not because you think you are always right. Because you have learned how to trust yourself without becoming trapped inside yourself. And somewhere along the way, the people who underestimated you may remember. They may remember the questions they laughed at, the instincts they dismissed, the moments they told you that you were thinking too much. They may look at the person you've become and realize they misunderstood what they were looking at. But here's the part that would have surprised the old you. You won't need them to admit it. You won't be waiting for the apology. You won't be checking to see whether they've finally recognized your value. Because somewhere along the way, your attention will have moved away from vindication toward construction. You will become more interested in what you're building than in who finally understands why you built it. Your energy will go into your work, your relationships, your health, your peace, your future. You won't be trying to win an argument that ended years ago. You'll be building a life that makes the argument irrelevant. And that's when you realize something. The greatest form of self-trust isn't believing that you were right about everything. It's knowing that whatever happens next, you can meet it without abandoning yourself. You can listen without losing your voice. You can question without losing your center. You can care without losing your boundaries. You can walk away without needing everyone to understand why. That is the future you're moving toward. Not louder, not colder. Not more defensive, calmer, more deliberate, more difficult to manipulate. And finally, more interested in building something real than proving something to people who once refused to see it. You are no longer waiting for validation, you're building internally. And eventually, what you build inside becomes impossible to hide outside. Once they mocked your mind, now they pause before they dismiss it. They listen a little longer. They choose their words more carefully. Even people who once saw your intensity as a problem can recognize something different now, clarity. But here's the truth. The real victory was never getting the therapist to defend you. It was never making the people who misunderstood you finally admit they were wrong. It wasn't watching someone change their opinion of you. The real victory was what happened inside you. You stopped needing them to change their minds. You stopped needing permission to trust your own experience. You stopped needing everyone in the room to agree with you before you could stand firmly in who you were, because you finally understood something. You were never broken. You were becoming. Every painful conversation taught you something. Every moment of doubt forced you to examine yourself more deeply. Every time you questioned your own perception, you eventually learned the difference between self-doubt and self-awareness. And now, This version of you is harder to manipulate, harder to intimidate, harder to provoke, harder to access. Not because you've built walls around yourself, because you've built a foundation underneath yourself. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to dominate a room to change its energy. You don't need to win every argument. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is remain calm while someone else is desperately trying to pull you back into an old version of yourself. They may never understand what changed. They may never apologize. They may never admit that the person they dismissed was becoming someone they could no longer control. And that's okay. Because you're no longer building your life around being understood by them. You're building it around being honest with yourself. Once they mocked your mind. They thought your mind was the problem. It was the warning.